Hello, Thais Sky here. I have been a little quiet on Reclaim the past few weeks, and I'm here to talk about it. I want to talk about what's been going on for me. I want to talk about cycles and balance. I want to talk about all of the things. So get comfortable in whatever it is that you're doing, and let's get into it. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women by women on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. So this 2-week hiatus, or however long it's been, is unusual for Reclaim. I've been very, very committed for the past 2 years to release Reclaim episodes every week, except when on hiatus. I say 2 years with a lot of confidence because October 8th is Reclaim's birthday. So this is it. This is 2 beautiful years of this podcast out in the world. And as episode 91, I'm so close to hitting 100 episodes. It's been such a beautiful journey. And I love every interview I've done for this podcast. Every single solo episode I have done. I've loved it. I've loved it. I loved it. I loved it. And so having this 2-week hiatus has been confronting for me, and it's been making me think a lot about my commitment to Reclaim and what it looks like to really show up. This is a conversation that I've been having with myself and with other people for years now. What exactly does it mean to show up? For many of us, showing up means consistency. It means being a very specific way again and again and again. And I think consistency is so important and critical and crucial for the life changes that we want to make. Right? Being consistent to ourselves, consistent to other people, it shows an integrity. It shows a sense of trust. I mean, being consistent is really important if we want to develop new habits. Consistency is a beautiful thing. However, there's something else that I think is really, really important to balance the idea of consistency, and that's this sense of cycles. This is something that I've written on Instagram, and I've talked a little bit about before on the podcast in a few episodes. But we are, as human beings, as humans, as animals on this planet, we are cyclical beings. We are cyclical beings because nature is cyclical, and we are a part of nature. I know that many of us pretend or like to think that humans are somehow detached or beyond nature, given how we're treating Mother Nature. It tells us a lot about how we feel like we belong here, but that's a conversation for another day. But the truth of the matter is we are cyclical. Nature is cyclical. We have seasons of weather changes. We have seasons of our lives. There are moments when we feel called to do a certain thing, and then there are moments where we don't feel called to do that thing. And I think it's really, really beautiful when we can recognize that our desires and our wants and our needs are cyclical, and to not expect us to show up the exact same way every single day, because it's actually quite impossible. For those of us who have a uterus and go through a monthly cycle, you know that who you are changes in that month. If you have more testosterone in your body, then you'll notice that your cycles tend to be daily. And every day, there's different parts of the days where you show up differently. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that it's these cycles that allow things to be balanced. It allows our lives to be balanced. If there's only growth, then we are in trouble. And that's exactly what we're doing when we're thinking about capitalism and economic growth, and this obsession with growth and only growth, is that it comes at a cost. We're now exploiting our earth. We have forgotten that death is an important part of life. Limitations, diminishing returns, right? Slowing down. Those are just, if not more important to growth, expansion. Retracting is important. And so cycles and living in cycles and being in our cycles, honoring the cyclical nature of our lives is really, really important. And I see a lot of this in my one-on-one work with clients that we really resist our cycles. For example, we'll go to the gym and we'll love it for a few months, right? And we're really committed to going to the gym and we're really in love and everything's good until it's not anymore. And then we shame ourselves for no longer being excited by going to the gym. We're no longer interested in going to the gym, and we think that that means that there's something wrong. But it could mean that there's nothing wrong. It could mean that you're just in a cyclical nature and there's a different type of movement that you're being called to do, or maybe you're not being called to do any movement, and this time is a time to rest. Right? This has certainly been the case for me. And the more that we can allow life to be as is, the more the less we suffer, for one, and the more we can then get creative in our listening instead of demanding that our lives be a certain way simply because it was this way in the past. We are constantly growing, evolving, and changing, and we are allowed to be changing our minds. Okay, so how does this relate to the podcast? Well, I have 6 months left of grad school. I am doing therapy part-time, and then I'm doing my coaching business part-time. I have a full one-on-one client load. I am running Worthy Women Rise. I have a lot on my plate, and I've been having a harder and harder time showing up for this podcast in a weekly sort of way. And when I sat with it and really listened to what I'm being called to do, the answer came quite naturally that I want to do an episode when I feel called to do an episode. And I want to release an episode with an interview when I have an interview with someone really exciting. But I don't want to just be forcing myself to interview people after people after people so that I can maintain a weekly podcast. I don't want to put mediocre material out there for the sake of weekly consistency. I would rather have less interviews and have them be more potent, like the one that I am releasing next week. It's so good. And as I was interviewing this guest, I was just thinking, this is what I want my podcast to be about. I want the interviews to excite me. I don't want them to feel like an obligation. And so I'm entering a different cycle with Reclaim. After 2 years of almost fully weekly consistency, I am changing my tune and I'm going for a slower pace. And maybe that will change in 6 months' time when I'm done grad school. That will be a huge, huge celebration. And maybe at that point, I will feel ready to recommence a weekly podcast. But right now, I'm trusting that this is what feels right for me. And as I'm thinking about this, the topic, the theme that has come up for me is this idea of balance. And this is a question I receive a lot, is like, how do you find balance in your life? What does balance look like? And there are some arguments that balance doesn't exist in our lives, and that the idea of balance is something that keeps us chasing a fantasy. Here's what I'll have to say about balance. When you think about balance in terms of walking, like what the requirement is to walk, what we're really doing is we're falling forward and catching ourselves. We are falling out of equilibrium, which is a standing position. We are in disequilibrium when we walk, right? We're falling forward and then we're catching ourselves. The same for riding a bike, right? Riding a bike is a really beautiful analogy of balance because you are literally learning how to balance your body over something that is very precarious. 2 wheels right in front of each other. And what balance is, as we learn how to ride a bike, is so subtle. It's riding a bike, being balanced on a bike is really about the micro shifts in our body to keep our body from falling. So really what balance is we're constantly falling to the right, to the left, to the right, to the left. And then we're micro attuning to those falls to catch ourselves. That is what I think balance is. It's about risking. Walking is a risk. Every step forward, you're falling. Bicycling, it's a risk. Balanced life is a risk. It's a risk that you're constantly catching yourself, right? So there's the risk and then there's the catching yourself. What a beautiful way of thinking of balance. Balance is not about finding some sort of like happiness and never moving. It's about constantly shifting, knowing that you're going to catch yourself. It's about constantly listening and attuning and recalibrating again and again and again. That's why I think like so many times when we make like a large decision, we think, oh, phew, I made the decision, that's it. But if you've made any type of decision, you know that there is no one big decision. It's a continual attunement. It's a continual shift and exploration, a leaning here, a leaning there, choosing here, choosing there. When we can respond to life in this way, we really open ourselves up to a different level of freedom. A freedom that comes in alignment with our forever changing nature. We are forever changing. And so why do we insist that we have to be the person that we were yesterday and the day before? Instead, how can we tune in? How can we listen to the changing needs and sink into it and trust it? Because the truly healthy, attuned way of thinking about life is knowing on a soul level that resisting life leads to suffering. And so accepting life as is, whatever comes up, that is so critical. And it's so fucking hard. We resist life, don't we? We resist the way people are. We resist how things are. We try to change things. We try to force things. We rebel against things. We push against things. And again and again and again, we realize that at the end of the day, if we do not accept, we cause suffering. Now, accepting, of course, does not mean to just lie idle while things that are unpleasant are happening around you. Acceptance is about just knowing that at every moment you get to respond to life by being open to what is here. Responding to what is here is different than forcing our will onto what is here. And I think that that's the crux of acceptance. So I have come to accept this new phase of Reclaim. I have grieved the loss of what Reclaim used to be. And I am excited at what Reclaim can be and what is available here as I continue to open and open and open and trust and lean and surrender. If you enjoy this podcast, and the best way that you can support it is by joining us on Patreon. Now, Patreon is something that I've also shifted a lot since I first started. When I first started Patreon, I wanted to shower people with gifts through secret access and all these things. And when I did that, I created a really beautiful community of women on Patreon that met monthly. And it was a beautiful circle, and I got to meet amazing listeners from all over the world. And it worked until it didn't. Until, again, my limitations with grad school and all of my obligations made me realize that it was not sustainable for me. And so then I had to grieve the loss of giving extra perks for people who subscribe on Patreon, and instead just lean into and trust that if people want to support the podcast, they are going to do that. And so with all things in life, we are forever invited to continue to lean into our evolution. And that means being clear-eyed and open heart and seeing every moment for what it is. And wherever we can't, which is most of us, most of the time, that's where the work lies, right? That's where the invitation lies. So if you would like to support the podcast, please consider donating through Patreon. You won't get any additional exclusive things, but you will get my forever gratitude, as every dollar that you put into Patreon goes directly into the back end of maintaining this podcast. In the meantime, I am going to continue trusting that whatever episode is meant to be launched will be launched. Next week, you have a real treat, a really beautiful interview, and then we're walking into the unknown together, and we'll see what this beautiful journey has for us. But I will say I am forever grateful for every single one of you who listen to this podcast. Every time you share it on Instagram or on Facebook and I get tagged, I'm just filled with so much gratitude for how this this platform is impacting you and how you're feeling called to share it. So thank you for sharing the podcast. Remember, life is about cycles. It's okay for your life to be cyclical. It's okay for you to change your mind. It's okay for you to let go of the old to make space for the new. I trust that you know how to create a life that works for you. So lean into that trust. And I will see you next week. Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.